Hello there, welcome to episode 97 of Right Where You're Sitting Now. We are doing a bit of a different kind of episode this week where I've got a guest co-host in to talk to our guest today. And welcome to Mario from Symbolic Studies. Give the audience a little bit of a intro to yourself and what it is you do.
Right on. Thanks for having me. So my project is called Symbolic Studies. So symbolicstudies.com if people are interested in any of my work. What I generally do is I follow each astrological sign during the sign itself, and I publish content based around those signs. I've been doing that for a number of years now. And I also create art prints based around the signs as well. So my main thing publicly on my channel has been more so related to astrology. But when I jump on podcasts like this, I tend to bring up northern and polar symbolism, which is what we're here for today, and which is how I found, who we're going to be talking to today, Wolfgang.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I first kind of found you on the One-on-One podcast, on One's podcast, and yeah, that's pretty much where I first started to hear about the kind of polar stuff, was you talking about it. And also where I first heard about Polaria, I think was on one of his shows a while ago, like a month or so ago.
But that makes sense.
Yeah, but we should talk about what it is we're actually going to be talking about. So we're talking about a book called Polaria, and we're talking with the author, who for a long time people thought was Kenneth Grant. And it turns out he actually isn't Kenneth Grant. There is another author called WH Müller or Wolfgang Müller. Tell us a little bit about Polaria. Give us a kind of, the cliff notes, as it were, or the back cover.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Polaria is about polar and northern symbolism. So it's unapologetically about this topic. And he weaves in a lot of information related to HP Lovecraft as well, and his lore and mythology, the characters he writes about. And essentially, Wolfgang thinks that HP Lovecraft's work was encoding polar symbolism, northern symbolism. And for me, I've been looking into this kind of material for a number of years now. So when I read it, I was all about it. And a lot of what he said resonated with me. But, I feel like the book is so much more than that. I do think that it is kind of in line with some kind of, I feel as though that the work is in line with maybe people who like Kenneth Grant. I think that they would like this work too. I read it thinking it was him until he reached out after the fact and said, no, I'm actually WH Müller. I'm not Kenneth Grant. This isn't a pen name or anything like that. But I kind of see it as almost a continuation of some of the things Grant was putting out about HP Lovecraft and some of the things he was talking about, say, in The Night Side of Eden, the Tunnels of Set. He does talk about northern symbolism to a certain degree, Ursa Major and Minor, the pole star, Set being related to Ursa Major and things like that. And I think that Wolfgang is kind of just more explicit, I guess, with these sort of correspondences and tends to go way deeper on the polar angle, which for me was a huge blessing and I appreciate.
And we talk about this in the interview, but Grant's kind of anchored a bit more in kind of Western esotericism, isn't he? And kind of Aleister Crowley's magic, and he's kind of blending almost. Yeah, I see what you mean. Muller's a lot more direct, isn't he? He doesn't seem to use that kind of esoteric tradition kind of stuff, really. He sort of goes in directly into the kind of polar tradition stuff. There's no Crowley involved or Golden Dawn involved. It's just pure kind of polar tradition kind of stuff, isn't it?
Exactly. Which, I was fascinated to learn that after the fact. He had never read Grant until several years after he published this work.
Or Crowley.
And so that was one of my first questions. Or Crowley, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I was blown away at that fact. He said, no, I'd never read any of his stuff until I think it was like maybe 5 or 6 years later, something along those lines. But yet, to me, it's in the same vein. There's so much overlapping information that I saw personally.
Yeah. One thing, we'll cut to the interview now, but one thing we should mention to listeners or viewers is Wolfgang's internet connection was a little bit squiffy on this interview, so there'll be a few edits that are a bit abrupt because his connection dropped quite a few times, didn't it? So so don't mind the editing. We're not cutting out any juicy information. We're literally just splicing together the bits where his connections gone down. So I thought I'd mention that here, just so in case people think that's a bit weird, because I don't normally harshly edit like that, but I'm going to have to on this one a little bit. But yeah, thanks so much for joining me on this interview. It was really good, and let's cut over to that now.
I'm the one to start? Okay. My name is Wolfgang Müller, normally called Wolf.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm now, if my reckoning is right, if I don't forget anything, I'm 59 years of age now. Right, yeah. And I wrote Polaria in 95, and it got published in 96. And that was about more than 10 years after I started delving into Lovecraft, and on all the various aspects and factors of his so-called fiction. And I wrote my first book in 1992, which was Treasure of the Forbidden. It was never published in English. And after my second one, on the Babylonian mythology and theology, which has connections with the so-called Necronomicon, I started working on Polaria, and that was a time when I was very much immersed in my love for France. I became France lover, and touring around France, and delving into French literature as well, on alchemy, Fulcanelli, authors like Fulcanelli, Cancelier, Ripley, Basil Valentine, all these staple publishers or staple authors, and then I authored Polaria, and since then I've been working on several subjects related to Lovecraft, like Hebrew Kabbalah and other sorts of directions that ramification. That's called ramifications from the basic Lovecraft subject. And my most recent book is Necro Yoga, which involves many practical techniques, sex magical techniques as well, and a new interpretation of the Babylonian epic of creation in relation to Lovecraft and some of his mythos elements. So that's my latest, actually.
The problem with Polaria is it's really hard to get hold of in a physical copy of the book. And I'm terrible reading off screen, so I've been slowly reading Polaria because it's quite... the text is quite dense, so you have to kind of go back on yourself a lot, I find. Well, I do anyway, to kind of, I'm not as steeped in this kind of polar tradition, I suppose. So for me, I'm having to kind of constantly go back and reread bits. And but I thought it'd be interesting to get the two of you together, and because it is a really interesting book. It's a fascinating topic as well. But I thought, yeah, it'd be good to get the two of you together and kind of almost sort of like curate a discussion between the two of you on this particular subject, because it's something that I'm really keen to learn about. And I have some questions as well. But I guess what is it that first of all, I suppose actually, Wolf, what is your take on Kenneth Grant's interpretation of HP Lovecraft? Have you ever read any of Grant's work? Or
well, the funny thing is that I'd never read anything by Kenneth Grant at the time I wrote Polaria. So all the rumors that go like I'm Kenneth Grant or I was familiar with him or even in touch with him are absolutely nonsense. Fact is that the first Kenneth Grant book I read was Night Side of Eden, and I did it. It was after the millennium, so it's almost more than 20 years ago. Before that time, I knew him, of course. I knew his name, but I never got around to read anything. It was hard at that time to get copies in Germany because at that time he wasn't translated. Now you get him in a German translation, some of his books at least. At that time, in the 80s or 90s, it was absolutely no way to get something, and that was the reason I didn't read him. So at the time I wrote Polaria, I was completely, I never thought of him, and so I developed my own ideas, my own theories, and my own conceptions as far as the Lovecraftian elements are concerned. And I was never really content with his interpretation of certain words Lovecraft used, certain encoded words like Yog-Sothoth or Shub-Niggurath. And I always found his interpretations shallow, a bit, how shall I put it, a bit too mainstream mythological. And that's why I developed my own ways, finding out more about them.
I think the thing with Grant, especially around the time you're talking about, like the 80s, 90s, he was kind of a bit of a, especially within the sort of thelemic communities, he was definitely a bit of an outcast because purely because he'd incorporated stuff like Lovecraft into kind of a Crowley kind of framework. And I think maybe that kind of coloured his interpretations of Lovecraft as well. I think if you look at the way he's using Lovecraft, it's definitely... Yeah, it's very, it comes from a very Crowleyan perspective a lot of the time. So he's trying to kind of combine, I guess, more Western esoteric kind of tradition terms with Lovecraft, isn't he? So so maybe that's where the kind of difference lies in a way. He's far more coloured by Crowley, by Spare, by all these kind of writers, whereas perhaps you're not. I don't know. What are you schooled in Crowley and the Golden Dawn, that kind of thing, or?
Well, I had never read anything by Crowley until after the millennium. I think that was, for me, it was kind of a break. And when I started studying Kabbalah, I got into Crowley, and that was the first time actually. Of course, I had heard of him, read some articles and stuff, but I never really got into him, into his theories on magic. So it was completely alien to me at that time in the 90s. Yeah, but you're right. He works within the Crowleyan and thelemic framework, which always kind of put me off because I got in contact with the OTO, the local OTO, in the end of the 90s, and was really put off by it. Was more or less a company, a band of how should I put it, half drugged, crazed, esoteric freaks, and more or less dabbling in a very superficial way with magic, And I remember conversations with these people, and they would sit down and after having a bottle of vodka, they would sit down and perform a Babylonian sort of stuff. And well, wild times at that time, but I was never really into that. No, so I went away.
I used to be a member of the ATO, and that's one
of
the.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's fine. The ATO bodies tend to be different around the world, but actually that is a common thread, that there's a lot of drinking and a lot of and actually that was kind of a bit off-putting to me as well, was the amount of, I don't know. I think if you're dealing with these kinds of let's say forces, for use of a better word, you should probably be in the right state of mind to be able to to do it properly. And that you do.
Well,
I mean,
whatever that is, whatever that is.
Yeah, and it's I don't think necessarily. I mean, even Crowley struggled with the ideas of being on drugs or drunk when performing magic. Obviously he was he had his own issues, but even he, if you read his writings, he talks quite a lot about, he seems to be unsure whether it's a good idea or not. I personally, from experience, I don't necessarily think it's a great idea to be a. So were you in Germany around that sort of time then?
Yes, I lived in Germany. I'm German. Yeah, I lived in Germany, and I got in contact with the local OTO.
Okay, interesting.
I'm based in Berlin now, and I was based in Berlin at the time as well. When I wrote Polaria, I was based in London. I lived in London for 10 years, so I wrote Polaria in London. But at that time I contacted the local OTO, which was expelled from Berlin actually by the Holy Inquisition. That's no joke. I think up to the 90s or even now, there's some kind of Inquisition going on, and it was I think it was the Protestant Church. It wasn't the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church, and they were really upset about the behavior of some of the members. and there were allegations of rape and any kind of criminal offenses. So they managed to expel them from Berlin at the end of the 80s. And then they moved on into Germany, into the rural areas. But then again, they got trouble there. I heard stories that they were not really welcome in a small town somewhere in Western Germany. And they had trouble with people there because the house where they lived, it was a big community house. It was called the Witch House. And so they would make for the rituals which actually happened, which somebody told me. So they were into rather strange activities which I couldn't share. I mean, I'm not in that kind of stuff at all. So I prefer to stay away from them.
Mm. It's interesting that you said you're writing a book about sex magic, but that seems to be a big deal in Germany. Like, obviously you've got like the Fraternitas Saturni and the original version of the OTO, which before Crowley was formed in Germany, and they were a lot more sex magic heavy than other groups.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. And funny thing to notice, the guy who was the German head of the OTO, Karl Germer. I think it was Karl Germer. He lived around the corner.
Oh, okay, interesting.
On the corner, in number 9, which is I live on a lake. To the back of my house is a big lake, and there is a promenade, and he lived right on the promenade of the lake. So it's just around the corner, and that's the place where Crowley stayed as well.
Interesting. Yeah, there was. We were talking to. We had a guy on recently called Frater UD, a guy called Ralph. He's written. Yeah.
I know my name.
Yeah, he was very involved with the setting up of the IoT and the kind of chaos magic, early days of chaos magic, and he's a member of the Fraternitas Saturni. But it sounds like there's a real rich history of magic in Germany, which I find kind of really interesting. It's kind of legendary in England, the German.
Is it really?
Yeah, which is interesting. Whereas apparently it's the other way around in Germany. According to Frater UD, he was saying, well, actually, it was when we were doing magic, it was always England that was always the the kind of the center of magic for them or whatever. But it's funny how that works. I'd be interested in, Mario, if you talk a bit about your research. You were saying that you'd spent a while conducting research on polar magic and this northern kind of. So I'm kind of interested in like what led you into that, like what got you into that kind of area of magic, and what were you sort of studying before that?
Right, sure. So I would say that my interest in sort of the polar northern symbolic angle started probably in 2014, 2015, somewhere around there. And when I found out that Polaris was the center of the heavens, essentially, from the perspective of Earth, all of the stars revolve around Polaris, the North Star, right? And so to me, this was really interesting, and I felt like I wanted to know more about it. And I had this insight that, in today's world, the way I tend to look at things, so I'm kind of going back and forth here, but I think we live in a solarized world. And so I think solar symbolism, the reverence for the sun, is kind of overemphasized in today's world. But over the years, as I've done research, I've realized, and thanks to guys like Wolfgang here, I realized that it seems as though, this is just my perspective, other people have written things along these lines, but that there have been 3 major symbolic traditions over time. And so we currently live in a solar age. Previous to that, it appears to be that there was a lunar age. Previous to that is the stellar or polar age. And so these 3 traditions have coexisted at the same time. But to me, it seems like a lot of symbols became solarized over time. And there's even deities that became solarized over time as well. Where back in the day, my understanding is that there are certain deities that were known as being northern polar gods, essentially. You could even say that someone like Christ, as an example, he became solarized over time. That actually early Christ, was way more mercurial in nature. And Mercury plays a big, big part in the solarization, Mercury plays a pretty big part in the polar tradition in northern symbolism, but I think even his essence has become solarized over time. And so my interest really began, to be honest with you, was looking into alternative cosmographies. Where do we live? What's the nature of Earth, as an example? So I started personally entertaining geocentrism, the idea that perhaps everything is revolving around us. The heliocentric versus geocentric debate, to me, really funnels down to an idea of what's spinning. Are the heavens above us spinning, or is the land that we live on, the soil underneath our feet, is that spinning? And so this debate has been going on forever. And so when I started looking into that, I noticed that geocentric sort of cosmologies placed more emphasis on the northern sky, on the North Star, on Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, on the North Pole. There's this idea called the world axis, or axis mundi, and it's this sort of bridge between the northern portion of Earth and the northern sky. And some people have said that this is the real stairway to heaven, right? This is the middle pillar in Freemasonry. So when you look at the three pillars in the Kabbalah, that central pillar is the pillar of transcendence, and the hidden Sephiroth, Doth, corresponds with the north. And so the other two pillars are lunar and solar. So I started noticing this over time, that in esoteric illustrations and things like that, there would be something solar, something lunar, but there would be this third thing, this third element. Sometimes it's mercurial. Sometimes it's related to the all-seeing eye. I did a presentation about the all-seeing eye, linking it to this central pillar of transcendence, to this world axis. You'll see Masonic tracing boards, and the central pillar sometimes has that eye of providence on it. And generally, it's shooting through the heavens. And oftentimes, it's associated with the east as well, which is kind of a whole rabbit hole of why is it associated with the east. And so to me, when I look at the polar northern tradition, I see that it's really the foundation for a lot of religious symbolism today. And it appears as though that when you really, really decode mythology, when you really decode a lot of esoteric symbols, I feel as though that everything goes back to this earlier polar stellar tradition, which is way more feminine in nature. So as the world got more solarized, I think a lot of deities and a lot of myths became more masculine as well. And I see that there is a relationship between the stellar polar tradition and the left-hand path. And a lot of traditions that are associated with the sun tend to be more right-hand path kind of in nature. And when I say that, I think that there's a positive and a negative left-hand path. I think that there's a positive and a negative right-hand path, personally. But at the end of the day, what I kind of see, though, is that a lot of my symbolic foundation was with the stars, was with astrology. And at a certain point, I kind of realized, I'm like, astrology, all of the signs along the zodiac, it's the path of the sun, it's the ecliptic. There were other traditions, though, before solar worship. There were other traditions before the prominence of the sun. And so in a lot of ways, these planets, the main planets, 7 or 9 planets, depending on, what system you follow, these appear to be newer gods. But the northern sort of symbolism really taps into an older classification of deity. And that's kind of one of my interests, is kind of noticing that the pole star is related to this imperishable, sort of timeless kind of quality to these older gods, to these older deities. And a lot of what people think is kind of the end-all be-all symbolic framework for today, like astrology, it appears to be a more new than not, and that a lot of solar symbolism is fairly young, actually. And so if you look in the tarot, the major arcana, there's the star card, followed by the moon card, followed by the sun card. All of these cards actually perfectly, beautifully, symbolically represent these 3 different traditions: the solar tradition, lunar tradition, stellar polar tradition. And so, so to me, this symbolism is the root of a lot of symbols that you see before you. So you see the circumpunct, the circle with a dot in it. People are going to say that that's the symbol for the sun. I see it as a polar symbol. And I'm kind of inclined to think that even the cross is actually just a polar symbol, but most modern people will see that as a solar symbol. I'm also inclined to think, kind of along the lines with the cosmography and cosmology angle, that I actually think we live in a polar system, not a solar system. That there's been this flip between polar symbolism and solar symbolism. And even a great book that I read before I read Polaria, it's called The Night of the Gods by John O'Neill. It was published in the late 1800s. He has a whole chapter called Polar versus Solar Worship. And he talks about the solarization of a lot of ancient polar symbols. And so that's a bit of a background on kind of, my personal angle with everything. I think that there's a relationship with polar symbolism and the world tree or the cosmic tree, the heavens as a wheel, axial symbolism is really a very important thing. And so, I would say it started off with my geocentric sort of interest and kind of went from there.
Yeah, and I can see where Lovecraft comes into that mix then as well. One thing that's interesting about Lovecraft and why I think Kenneth Grant got so much kind of pushback when he started to try and introduce Lovecraft into the OTO and into his system of magic, into the more Crowleyan system of magic. It's because it's Lovecraft himself said that he wasn't interested in the occult, didn't he? And he said that he wasn't interested in he said that he wasn't secretly writing occult text. However, there's nothing to say. I've read a lot of Lovecraft, if not all of Lovecraft, I think, and I read that and I think, are you sure? Do you know what I mean? You read some of Lovecraft's text and you think, I think he's more into the occult than he definitely let on, and possibly he was maybe he feared stigmatization or something like that, because obviously the occult doesn't have, especially around his time, didn't have the greatest reputation, did it? So there is this sort of part of me that thinks, yeah, maybe you guys are right when it comes to, and Grant was right as well when it comes to Lovecraft and the way he seemed to receive his characters and his, they seem to come through dreams and through these like hypnagogic states, and it sounds a lot like occult to me. Do you know what I mean? It sounds like, so I can see why A, there was a pushback for Grant especially, but B, I can see why Grant thought that way, and also why I assume Wolf also felt that way. But so I don't know, how did you kind of bring these two things together, Wolf? Like why Lovecraft essentially?
Why Lovecraft for me? Why I was so attracted by Lovecraft, you mean, Paul?
Yeah.
Well, the first story, as far as I remember, the first story I read was At the Mountains of Madness.
Mm-hmm.
And it struck a chord in me because I instinctively, obviously, I wasn't aware of that at that time when I started it at the beginning of the 80s. I felt instinctively the otherness in Lovecraft. As far as I remember, I was always someone discontent with mainstream explanations and mainstream theories concerning the universe and how things are supposed to be. So I felt attractive. I felt like it's like a surge, and felt attracted by the otherness in Lovecraft. And for me, from the first moment onward, it was absolutely clear, beyond a doubt, that Lovecraft used the medium of fiction, or so-called fiction, pseudo-fiction, to transmit a unique kind of knowledge, a unique kind of tradition and insight in a certain tradition, used this medium of fiction as a medium, fiction as a medium. So I went about to find out the mechanisms in Lovecraft and how he managed to create such an atmosphere, at the same time transmitting fact. I mean, you have a fictional, more or less fictional wraparound story, and you have a core secret, a core fact in it. And that's ingenious to write a story like that, and that's I think part of the recipe of success of Lovecraft stories, because people instinctively feel that there's something beyond that florid fiction work he produced. And yes, and then I dived into Lovecraft and found that there was an occult, is an occult tradition behind him. And my first book, Treasure on the Forbidden, was on his biographical relationship. I mean, there are certain points in his biography which are really strange. For example, the name Abdul Hazret, for example, he was named Abdul Hazret from the age of 6. And he was, I mean, the age of 6, you're a kid, you have no clue of anything. So there must have been a reason, I suppose. And then I delved deeply into his biography and found very strange events in his life that argue synchronicity. His life was a symbol, and it can be compared to the life of other people, occult people, very famous occult people, like Crowley, for example. He lived a symbolic life, and all his life he was busy transmitting what came through him, ran through him, was channeled through him. And I'm sure today that he wasn't always certain what things are about. He just produced it and tried to put it down in his language, or the way he could imagine it, or clad it or clothe it in words. Very hard at times. So he came up with very bizarre images, for example, like images you find in stories like Call of Cthulhu, or even at the Mountains of Madness, where you have this city, this absolutely crazy city, alien, more than alien architecture they find in Antarctica, and very bizarre details. But one thing, and this is the thing Marion mentioned, the polar symbolism is very prominent in Lovecraft, and that what struck me from the first time I wrote it, because Antarctica is the South Pole, and I've been always drawn to Antarctica for some reason, and that's why Antarctica is fascinating for me until the present day. And starting from the meaning of the South Pole and trying to study the meaning, the occult meaning of the South Pole, the South, in tradition, in Kabbalah, for example, I went on and came into and entered into more details on polar symbolism in general, like the North Pole and the world axis and East and West and North and South and all that. So I was in a sense spreading out. My interest was spreading out. But the core secret of Lovecraft is a secret tradition, which is absolutely alien, as he rightly said. I think it was in Call of Cthulhu, a tradition which is unknown beyond its members. It is virtually unknown. And all religions, all traditions, everything you can get hold of are just an echo, more or less precise or accurate echo of that original primordial tradition. And that tradition is basically polar. And that's where we come to polar symbolism at the core of Lovecraft. And prominent in his fiction is Antarctica. And that's why Antarctica has become such a focal point in recent days. In 2016, there was a phenomenon starting in Antarctica that news came out on various channels that the fallen angels, for some reason, the fallen angels, Nephilim, were rediscovered or are back on Earth. Very strange news. And it is no secret to tell, and I wrote it in some of my books, that Lovecraft's version of the Nephilim, which means giants, is old ones, the great old ones, the great gigantic old ones, which means the Nephilim, the biblical Nephilim. So here we're touching, converging onto one strain of tradition, which is primordial, and which is unfortunately absolutely covered up in the Bible and related traditions, because people don't want this tradition to become known to man. It is very unpleasant because history is connected with it and so on. So many ramifications into the modern world as well. But the polar symbolism, as far as I can say, is the basic core secret in Lovecraft.
It's interesting.
So we're talking polar.
Yeah, you're talking about one thing I've theorized when it comes to Lovecraft is that he possibly didn't actually this is going to sound a bit strange, but he might, and I think you sort of alluded to it a little bit earlier, was that he may not have actually fully understood what was transmitted to him, but he just put it into text, kind of thing. And that's not a uncommon thing, actually. If you look at, like, historically, people have these experiences and it kind of changes them. Some modern examples would be, I mean, like David Icke, for example, the conspiracy theorist. He had this kind of experience where he said that, you know, information is being transmitted to him, and he had the same with Philip K. Dick, with Robert Anton Wilson, Timothy Leary, all these people. They were sort of suddenly receiving information and trying to decode it in the best way that they felt, or, you know, the most accurate way they felt they could. And I wonder if Lovecraft had a similar experience and, you know, was decoding it through fiction. Does that ring?
There's an explanation to that phenomenon that people. I think Fulcanelli wrote about it. I think it's just I think it's maybe in the Mystery of the Cathedrals, and he wrote that referring to alchemy. And Lovecraft was referring to alchemy as well. I mean, you remember the case of Charles Dexter Ward is purely alchemical. So referring to alchemy, or referring to the alchemical allegory, Fulcanelli says that this process, which we can also call a magical process, you're not actually starting the process yourself. You're logging onto it. You're getting linked to it. You're connecting to it. And that's the mystery. You're connecting to an existing process, ongoing process, and you become part of it. And in the moment you become part of it, you're absolutely stunned. You're fascinated, you're stunned, and you don't know where you are, because things are changing. Things are being changed for you. You are changing. That means the process is doing something with you. You can't do so much about the process itself once it's started. You can observe it. You can hardly manipulate it, because it's an ongoing thing. And sometimes you even feel falling prey to it, because it does with you what it wants. I mean, it's not human. It's not for you. It's for a higher purpose. And you have to attune to that higher purpose. You have to understand this higher purpose. And the process of understanding the higher purpose of that ongoing process is what makes people creative. What makes people like Edgar Allan Poe, for example, creative, and Lovecraft creative, because there's no other way to get that pressure out of you, that insight, tremendous insight, cosmologically, anything, than put it down on paper. I mean, to write it down, regardless if it's true or not, regardless if it's accurate or not. I mean, you write it down, you become creative. In the long run, you are getting more and more accurate, because you're gaining more and more insight. But it's a very strange, it's going along with strange sensations, feelings, and all sorts of stuff. And that's, I think, Lovecraft was caught up in this process. Edgar Allan Poe, I know, was caught up in that process, because Tikeleli, the famous words Lovecraft mentioned in At the Mountains of Madness, originally come from Edgar Allan Poe. It's Edgar Allan Poe invention. Tikeleli, these terrible sounds the explorers hear in Antarctica, in the City of Madness. And so Poe was more or less the predecessor. He came before Lovecraft, and Lovecraft was taking a lot of things, a lot of details from Edgar Allan Poe, and he was caught up in the process as well. Another guy who was caught up in the process, as far as I'm concerned, I think, is Jules Verne. Jules Verne was also very close to that stream of tradition, to that primordial tradition, ongoing thing, which you can't stop, which is going on in another dimension, which is completely alien. Not in an extraterrestrial sense, but alien in a dimensional sense. So these three people are very interesting to study because of that. And I plan to write a book on all three of them, calling them the Draconian prophets, because they are Draconian prophets. They are prophets of the Draconian tradition. And there are many, many details in Poe as well, which have never been mentioned so far, or even, dealt with. I know of nothing, no author has ever talked about Edgar Allan Poe and his relation to magic or alchemy. And so I wanted to change that and write a book on it, see what comes out of it. But this is the this is what I think about this. How should I put it? This process. Lovecraft was caught up, and the results are on the table. Great books, great messages. Only we need to decode it.
Yeah, yeah,
excellent.
It's definitely interesting. I think you could argue to a degree that Crowley also went through that process, but he brought it on manually, as it were, through magical, the magical process. Like, you could argue that all magic is tapping into that primordial thing that you're talking about. It's the Holy Guardian Angel experience that seems very similar to what you're describing there. Yeah, where you're suddenly becoming in contact with some kind of intelligence or creative process that's kind of has a big influence on your life and seems to guide it in a certain way. And you could also say that
guiding. It's a guidance. It's kind of guidance, but it needs to be genuine. I mean, for example, these people I got to know in the OTO, the local OTO, they weren't the genuine kind of people. I mean, they were just trying to push their luck by means of drugs, and I think that's the wrong way. It can be really dangerous, and I heard of stories that really people went mad, while practicing Babylonian magic, because it's a very strong kind of magic, and so you have to be careful. It's not to tinker with, something to play with, and that's, I think, one reason why Lovecraft always refused to admit that he was into the occult and into magic, because he wanted to stay other people away from it. I think he was aware of the dangers of it, and there are dangers, and but the phenomenon is, I think, with magic, with Crowley, we have the same thing in the case of Crowley. Many alchemists probably, Kenneth Grant, I suppose Kenneth Grant as well to a certain degree, but Crowley was a prominent example, for being locked onto that certain kind of stream of consciousness.
Yeah, sure.
There you go.
Oh, I'd just like to add real quick, it's not a coincidence that the Magician card, the Magus card in the Crowley deck, you'll notice actually that the Magician is right in front of a vertical pole that extends to the very top to the very bottom of the card. This is the first card in the Major Arcana, number 1. Literally, the number 1, the vertical line, is a reference to the world axis. It's a polar symbol. Even the letter I is a reference to the polar axis, in my opinion. In the Bach saga, it said that the lowercase I is literally the world axis with the pole star on top of it. So to me, I think he had some sort of awareness of this. The Magician is ruled by Mercury. Mercury goes up and down the world tree, or goes up and down this stairway to heaven. That's how he goes between planes of reality. So Mercury, being the messenger, the traveler, he goes up and down the world axis between these different dimensions, if you will. And his symbolism is heavily tied to this polar northern sort of current that we're talking about. And I'm glad, Wolfgang, that you mentioned the Draconian tradition, because that's the heart of the Draconian tradition. This is the heart of the Typhonian tradition, and it goes by many other names as well. And so, different sort of schools of thought relating to the primordial mother, the dark mother, is related to all of this stuff very, very heavily.
That's right. Exactly.
Well, as I was prepping for the show, I was going through Polaria again, and I was looking at certain aspects of the book, and I'm like, what is the thing that got me the most excited about this? And for me, it was the fact that Wolfgang in Polaria is talking about northern polar symbolism overtly. Whereas a lot of other books kind of skirt around it, or I've read Night Side of Eden, I've read other books where it's discussed here and there, but that's not the focus, that's not the core. Here, it's more of a focus. So as an example, I was just reviewing it this morning or last night, and he says explicitly that the caduceus, Hermes Mercury's caduceus, is a polar world axis symbol. And I'm like, I know that to be true, but most other people have no awareness of that at all. And yet he's explaining it perfectly. And that's the accurate sort of correspondence. The other thing I'll say for me that really hit home is this idea of a pilgrimage to the pole. And so to me, what seems to be the case is that just to kind of lay a little bit of a groundwork for people, is that there's a number of cultures who place their supreme deity at the north. That there's a northern correspondence with their supreme deity. Whether they're aware of this or not, all of the symbolism to me points in that direction. It's been said that the throne of God exists, in the northern sky. This is another thing that's kind of been said. The other idea here is that a number of groups claim to have an Arctic origin, and they believe in an Arctic return. And so the North has been looked at as the place where humanity came from. Some people believe that there was an exodus out of the North for various reasons, perhaps a pole shift or a catastrophe, something along these lines. But that ultimately we come from the North and return to the North. That's my perspective. So every pilgrimage is sort of a northern pilgrimage. Every culture that has a sacred center, a holy of holy, they are mirroring this sacred center northern sort of location that they believe they came from. So Mecca, the Kaaba cube, is a perfect example of this. And they have this black stone on the corner of the cube, right? And what do? You go to Mecca and you circumambulate the cube 7 times. Ursa Major and Minor each have 7 stars. There's a huge correspondence with septenary symbolism, the number 7, and the northern sky. And there's a huge correspondence as well with the number 8, which Wolfgang gets into heavily in Polaria, which is brilliant stuff. And so there has always been this idea of a central stone. Sometimes it's referred to as a lodestone or a black stone. And some people have said that this stone is magnetic, which is why your compasses point north. To me, when I look at a compass and the idea that it points north, I see this as a physical and a metaphysical thing. It's actually kind of, it operates in both worlds, I suppose. And so this idea of a whitening stone, I'll let Wolfgang talk about that. But I just wanted to kind of point out this pilgrimage sort of concept, this sacred center concept. And then I believe even the stone on the Kaaba cube was once white and then actually turned black at some point. That's the mythology, at least. But this stone sort of concept, Wolfgang, if you want to talk about that, feel free.
The stone concept, well, which is the title of the book Polaria, the white stone. Earlier on, I mentioned that stream of consciousness you can log onto and use for certain purposes. We know that there are 2 ways, 2 traditions, the left-hand path and the right-hand path. So there must be a difference between the 2. And in most texts, for example, I know of, these two things are mixed up. I mean, nobody really tells you what the left-hand path is, what its really real purpose is. Same with the left-hand path, right-hand path. Now, imagine the axis, imagine the world axis, and which adds stability to a system. It's a central pillar of the Sephirotic system, and it adds stability to a system, a given system. Now, the Earth is a given system. You have Earth magnetism, you have 2 poles, and you have the 2 poles interconnected by an axis in the middle. Now, what to do with the axis? I mean, your axis, you've got an axis in your body as well. It's the axis between the lower or the lowest chakra, the Muladhara chakra, the earth chakra, and your top chakra, your crown chakra. In the normal state, these chakras are more or less aligned. It could happen, and I think Kenneth Grant refers to that in one of his books, that as he said, by accident or by a flaw in a ceremonial ritual, it can happen that this axis becomes tilted. That there, all of a sudden, there is a very small, slight tilt in the whole system, which brings the whole system out of original stability. Now, is the original stability we're living with the primordial stability? I mean, this is the basic question, because most people think that the world we're living in is a perfect world. The world, as things are, or the elements are aligned to each other, is a perfect system. It works perfectly. In alchemy, there are 2 stones, a white stone and a red stone. And if you want the state of harmony, the state of stability, like, for example, in the Egyptian crown, depicted in the Egyptian crown, the typical Egyptian crown on the head of Horus, is a crown which is red and white. So both, which are, by the way, the colors of Christ, which are red and white. So this indicates the harmony of the system. But the problem is, if you want to, how should I put it, to damage the harmony for a certain purpose, to leave the matrix, because system, you have to find a way out of the system if you want to go out of the system. So if you want to reach the other side, if you want to make contact with the other side, like in Lovecraft, for example, people do, or the protagonists usually do, are doing something very bizarre to get out of the system, you have to create a stone which is not the stone which is white and red. You have to create a stone which is red, because red is the color of judgment. White is the color of mercy. And in the stone, in the horror stone, the stone of the equilibrium, mercy and judgment combined in one Horus. But as you know, Horus is the enemy of Zut, Zet, Thes, or Satan. So the system installed here on this planet or in this universe is the Horian system, which is the reason why the most, for example, Schwaller Lubitz, a very famous French author, wrote that the ruling brotherhood on Earth, esoteric brotherhood, is a Horian brotherhood. It is perpetrating the Horian world. The Horian world is a state of status quo. It is as it is now, and it wants to stay what it is. So if you want to change it, you have to work with the elements concerned. And this is the stone. The stone is the actual center part of the system. It's found in the center. It's found in your center. So from there you have to go. It's a stepping stone. It's a step, really, in literal sense, it's a stepping stone. You have to step from there. And that's what Mary said. It's like Jacob's ladder. It's a ladder going up to the north. Now, in Hebrew tradition, for example, that's the reason why the north, the cosmic north, or the metaphysical north, is always pictured evil. It's always evil, because evil comes in from the north in Kabbalah. The temple is, Jerusalem is open on the northern side. And that's the gateway where evil comes in. So you have to close it. In Hebrew Kabbalah, it is said you have to close yourself to the north. In the original polar tradition, it is said you have to open up yourself to the north. You have to step out of the system, the matrix, to find the way out. And this is by reversing the poles, because reversing the whole system. South has to become north, and north has to become south, as the Egyptians knew to tell. And this is where the system collapses. And this temporal collapse is the price to be paid. Lovecraft wrote in To the Gates of the Silver Key that there's a terrible price to be paid for those who want to get out of the system, who want to take him as a guide out of the universe. And it's true, and it's not also to be taken lightly. It's not a decision to be taken lightly. And many people get in touch with it unwillingly, out of surprise. I mean, they just hit it for some reason. They touch it without having the intention to. So the reversal of the system is always a token, a sign that something is coming in and getting out, like swapping the hour clock, turning it around. The sand is, dropping, the sand is streaming from one side to the other. And again, if you turn northern symbolism that's why northern symbolism is very ambivalent, because sometimes it's good, sometimes it's evil, because most traditions, like the Hebrew tradition, picture it evil. Other traditions, for example, the Hindu traditions, picture it good. The Arctic homeworld, the Arctic paradise. In Hinduism, the homeworld, the original homeworld, is in the Arctic area. I mean, terrestrially speaking and metaphysically speaking. So it always depends on the focus of your tradition. And the basic work is to understand the system. If you understand the system, you can work with the elements of the system. And you have to be aware of the fact that you have to change the elements. You can't work with the elements as they are right now. Impossible. And that applies to the chakras, that applies to the axis as well. And it applies to being aware of the meaning of the poles, south and north, in your body, in your own body. You know, the whole thing. And you're an image of Earth. You're in Earth, a small Earth in itself. You have a body which has a magnetic, which is linked to the magnetic field, Earth magnetic field. You're a small image of the big one. So it's the same principles, basically, and that's why alchemy is so ambivalent. And my book, for example, put the focus on the white stone explicitly, more or less explicitly. I think I didn't write much on the red stone at that time, but 30 years have elapsed since then, and now I'm able to talk about the red stone as well.
This as above, so below relationship is really important to kind of understand with northern polar symbolism. We have a spine. You know, it's interesting. The world axis. There's so many symbols for the world axis, right? And believe it or not, many symbols that look very phallic in nature are world axis symbols when you really decode their sort of primordial essence. So the sword, the post, I think of post office, and that relates to Mercury as well. And I was mentioning that pole behind the magician and the magician card. The standing stone, the obelisk, these are all polar symbols, in my opinion, right? But our spine, which is actually an anagram for penis, by the way, and also has that word pine right there. So there's a world tree sort of reference, in my opinion. Pines are some of the oldest trees on Earth. It's a world axis symbol. And Wolfgang has some beautiful stuff to say about our heart actually being symbolic of this center as well, this sacred sort of center within our body. And so when you decode symbolism, every symbol has a center, both sort of literally, but also metaphorically, right? So a lot of Eastern philosophies talk about the still point within. You know, if you're looking at a mandala, you have to acknowledge the central point of the mandala. There's lots of meditative symbols that the center portion of the symbol is the most important part because it is the axis that everything revolves around. Wolfgang, I'm glad you brought up the fact that the world axis is related to stability. So when royal people or people of authority, when they are carrying a wand, which is also another world axis symbol, or a scepter, scepter relates to septenary, which relates to the number 7, which to me I identify as a northern sort of number because of Ursa Major and Minor. What they're really holding is a symbol of power. The rod is another example. They're holding a symbol of power. They're holding a symbol of authority. The world axis relates back to the law as well. And basically, it is related to structure. So what I've decoded, I did a presentation called Decoding Chaos. There's this idea that the primordial universe had all of the elements, but everything was kind of in this heap, if you will. It was an amalgamation. It was a mixture of all of the different elements. Everything was kind of fused together, very, very chaotic. But it wasn't until the world axis came about did the elements get separated. The world axis is symbolic of the separation of heaven and earth, but also the connection between heaven and earth as well. You can see this all day in the magician card. That's why he's doing the as above, so below kind of posture, because he's saying that I both connect what's above and below, but I also separate what's above and below, just like the world axis, which has been likened to a ladder, a tree, you know, a tower, all of these different sorts of things. But regarding the central stone real quick, you know, to me, it seems as though this is the primordial sort of spiritual backbone of everything, is having this central location that you can call your own, that you can defend. And so there's this great book by this guy named John Michel. It's called At the Center of the World. And he goes through all of these different tribal traditions where these people would have a central tree. That was their world tree. This is where they buried the ashes of their family members. This is what they put in sort of the highest sort of tier in their spiritual sort of framework. And so if that tree was destroyed or lost or what have you, they were a lost people because that tree symbolically, just like the world axis, it brought structure, it brought stability, it brought order, it gave them something to revolve around. And so for a very, very, very long time, different indigenous groups and native peoples, they would have this central hearth, this central fire, this central stone. Sometimes it would be a mound. But this is all northern polar symbolism, in my opinion, and really it mirrors the dynamic of this northern sort of concept, this point of origin and return. I think this is what a lot of Atlantean symbolism is about. There's so many claims about where Atlantis is, right? There's a lot of researchers that will find these different temples or things like that, and they'll say, "Oh, Atlantis was here, Atlantis was there." The idea, like Plato's Atlantis, this concentric ring sort of concept, is northern symbolism. My understanding is there were a lot of groups way back when people were more under the sort of stellar polar umbrella of things, where they would have this central location and they would have a ring land system that would kind of fan out from there. So you lived in a concentric ringed reality. And that center was the Holy of Holies. Sometimes there would be a temple there, things along that nature. You know, we have the idea of a city center, right? And things kind of expand out from the city center. It's not uncommon to have, a city with polis at the end, metropolis, as an example, a large city. That polis is a reference to the pole, Polis, right? So the pole has been this sort of symbol that it can very easily get overlooked and you don't understand its implications, but it is absolutely everywhere once you have the eyes to see it and once you've researched it a bit. There's a lot of polar symbolism out in the world. Go ahead.
Yeah, great. The mystery of alchemy and the mystery of magic is creating a metaphysical structure. And this is what you're referring to. I mean, you're referring to a metaphysical structure which is a mirror image or an image of the structure of Earth. I mean, you have two poles and you have an axis interconnecting both poles. So there's one episode in the Bible which is really interesting because it's talking about this process, the process you're just talking about, and it's about this quarrel at Pharaoh's court between Moses and Pharaoh. And it's about the rod, Aaron's rod, and about the rod that becomes a serpent, or the serpent that becomes a rod. And this is actually the translation of the work of the alchemist or the magician, because it is said that the stone is formed out of the waters of the soul. You have to take your soul, you have to take the elements of the soul, which is water, soul is water, and related to the moon. And you have to form out of this water, this soul water, a hardened substance. You have to harden the substance. And you have, in other words, out of the serpent, which is a symbol of life and related to water, you have to create a rod, a stability. Because the serpent has to become stable. Water has to become hardened. It has to harden somehow. And this is a lithic structure, like a stone. It's compared to a stone. So a mineral actually. So once you have the rod, you can ascend. And you have the basic part, which is found in a sphere revolving around of a sphere. And it's relating to the letter P, for example, as well. 3.14, which is very, very important in Kabbalah, because the name Shaddai, the holy name Shaddai, is the same, more or less the same numerical value as the letter P, 3.14. So P is the mathematical the mathematical rendering of the metaphysical process. It's just a translation of it. And so P is very important. It's your axis. You're related to P. And this structure is metaphysical. So you have to, the work of alchemy is building a metaphysical structure from the stone. And the stone is the basic, the main part, actually, the main part, because it's your foundation. That's why it's called the foundation stone in religion. The church is built on the foundation stone, and this is the basic foundation stone. So the rod is important because the rod is the phallic symbol, and that's why you can ascend to the heavens, to the north. So we have the polar tradition, essentially polar. It's essentially polar. It can't be more essential.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Go ahead if you want to say something.
I was going to say, I'll putting my conspiracy theory hat on for a second. There's 2 points I've thought of. I think one of you mentioned earlier about this kind of concealing of this tradition. When you think of like the way the North is kind of portrayed in the media, I'm thinking specifically of things like Game of Thrones, where the North is in a snowy, icy wasteland, and there's a big wall separating it from the normal, people, and these kind of evil, kind of primordial forces in the North. Do you think that there's some kind of link between there's some kind of effort to suppress this kind of more primordial?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Ever since.
Interesting.
Ever since there's anybody. Ever since. I mean, it's in Kabbalah, for example, mountain is forbidden. Forbidden to climb Mount Saffron, which is the northern point. It reaches to the midnight sun, the area of the midnight sun, and with the midnight sun, the black sun, because the black sun is the actual sun of transformation, and it's a transformed sun. It's the original metaphysical sun, not the physical sun. So it's your internal sun. I mean, it's just about creating a personal sun, a personal light in yourself, which is your light of complete consciousness. And it is forbidden, I'll tell you quite categorically, it is forbidden it's forbidden for man to create complete consciousness. Because once you have created complete consciousness, you're out of the system. You're out of anything. You're free.
Do you think Lovecraft, Lovecraft, in his books, whenever someone kind of encounters an old one or some kind of, creature linked to an old one, they go insane. I've seen the face of God and it is terrible, that kind of thing. It's do you think that is a kind of weird freedom in its own sense? Do you think insanity is the realization of the whole kind of thing? Is it like is that what Lovecraft's trying to say, do you feel?
To be honest with you, I think insanity, like madness, for example, mountains of madness or insanity, is just a term for alluding to the fact that things are completely changed. I mean, completely changed. Crowley wrote, magic is energy tending to change. And most people don't want to change, because any change, outward, inward change, is regarded like, I don't want to have to do something with it. So that's why insanity is something like madness. I said to Mario the other day that the Mad Arab, that's the author of the Necronomicon, the fabled author of the Necronomicon, he is said to be mad because he is out of his stability. He's out of line with the axis. He's disattuned in a sense. And he's becoming mad because he's seeing something which is beyond the system. And to be honest, you have to be mad in this metaphysical sense to be able to see what's beyond the matrix, or what's actually the origins. And that's why they use the word, you can use the word insane, whatever. Rendering of a metaphysical state which can't be described, could be described differently, but I mean it's a good way to describe it, because you're out of your system, you're out of your mind, you're absolutely stunned, you're fascinated, you're speechless, or you're gone for the world, more or less. And that's what that's why the message is mad,
I mean, that would happen as well if you're talking about kind of the poles suddenly twisting round or something like that. That would also symbolically be a form of kind of madness in itself, wouldn't it? I mean, the way you'd interpret that would be, you wouldn't know how to interpret that because it's everything's back to front, that kind of thing. It's kind of what you hear when people take certain drugs, like psychedelic drugs, that you often hear that description of it's like the poles being like twisted around. Like people that take DMT often talk about that, like this reality flipping. You always hear that kind of expression, things flipping round. Like I often wonder if that's a kind of allegory for something a bit more metaphysical or spiritual.
Right. Yeah, an inversion regarding this northern polar suppression. To me, it's no surprise after doing all of this research that the swastika is as, kind of notorious and as frowned upon as it currently is in the West. Because to me, the swastika, what it comes down to is you're seeing Ursa Major go around the pole star once a season, essentially. So even Ursa Major literally looks like the number 7. So I'm inclined to think personally that the number 7, the shape of the number 7, is a direct reference to the Big Dipper. Right. And so the swastika is a symbol of this. And so it's a symbol of this around the world. My understanding is that 90% of Earth's population has a view of the circumpolar constellations. That's Ursa Major and Minor revolving around the pole star. Right. And so you can't see the circumpolar constellations from everywhere in the world, but 90% of the world's population is just north enough to be able to see it. And so there are different cultures around the world that literally have a pole star deity or have a Big Dipper deity. Basically, there are a number of traditions that say that there's sages. The Apkalu is one of them. The Rishis are another. 7 sages that come from the north and bestow wisdom upon humanity. So in India, there's a pole star deity named Durva. In Japan, there's a pole star deity named Yokin. I think there's more actually, but like I said earlier, I think a lot of these deities have become solarized over time. But it was really amazing to me to be in India and to see these different really small taxi rickshaw sort of cars have a red swastika on it with gigantic red letters that say Aryan. And I'm like, this is amazing, And so to me, the word Aryan is a reference to this Arctic homeland, and the swastika is an Arctic northern polar symbol. And it's one of the most beautiful symbols in existence, in my personal opinion. And so to me, there's been a suppression to kind of twist and invert the symbolism to make it seem like a bad thing. In my opinion, northern polar symbolism gets to the core of everything, and it's really holistic, and it brings you back to self. It's actually self-empowering. It brings you back to your true essence, to your true north. It speaks to your divinity and your connection with the cosmos and everything else. To me, a lot of the solar worship, the solarization of everything, it actually is disempowering. It takes power away from you. You're looking outside of yourself. You want external solutions. You want external validation, things like that. The polar tradition, it's actually, the more you tap into it, it really brings you to that still point within that so many different, spiritual schools of thought have talked about.
I can give you a good example of this polar cover up. It's a cover up actually, and it's been ongoing for many thousands of years. One very very prominent example is the Ark of Noah, or Noah's Ark, because it is very obvious that the word Ark is clear. It's like a box or a crate or whatever, just a kind of container. But what is Noah? Originally, it was solarized. The original word was solarized. Noah is behind the word Noah. The Hebrew word Noah is the early Semitic nu or no. Crowley used the word nut. Egyptian equivalent is nut. And nut is the night. It's night. It's female. The nu-ah, for example, linguistically speaking, the ach, nuach, the sound of the ach is an ak, which is a genitive case behind nu. It literally means of nu, of the night. It is actually the ark of the night is not male, it's female. Because the ark of the night is the moon. Noah's Ark is a rabbinical code for the moon. And all these episodes linked to Noah's Ark are basically referring to the moon and the mystery of the moon. So this is a very prominent example. And we have lots of examples in the Bible, for example, where the feminine became masculine, mostly that way around, feminine becoming masculine. Hardly the other way around. I mean, mostly because the northern light is called mother night or midnight. The midnight sun is the mother night sun, the maternal sun, and the maternal sun is female. So the way leads up to the female, not to the male. And this was turned upside down by covering up. The whole was turned upside down because it was solarized. And by solarizing it, everything became male. And the female aspect of creation, like the creatrix, became subdued. It's hardly visible anymore. I mean, in the Christian tradition, for example, Maria is a very tabooed subject. It's related to more or less the underground tradition in France, for example. So that hints at conscious cover-up, deliberate cover-up. And this cover-up is even penetrating media, of course. I mean, lots of movies out there where the North is always evil. For example, another example, have you ever watched a movie, these famous mummy movies of the 40s and 50s and 60s, American movies, cheap B movies? Have you ever seen one of these mummy movies where the mummy is good? The mummy is always the evil, because the Egyptians means north. So the whole episode, the whole story, the quarrel and the fight, and even the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt is all about the change of north and south.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Right. One of the things that I picked up from Wolfgang in Polaria, and then he since recommended a book that got into it a little bit more that I'm currently reading, is this idea of the mystical East, or even the word Oriental, basically being a reference to orientation. And if you're going to get oriented, if you're going to have correct orientation here in this plane, it's good to know where north is. And so the North Star is the preeminent star for sea navigation. And even if you were looking at other constellations to understand where you were at in the open sea, you have to know where those stars are located in relation to the north, right? So generally these fixed stars, that is what you're looking towards to get the right orientation. Or where are you headed? Are you headed east, west, north, south, right? So Oriental is a reference to orientation. And this quest for the Orient, I've learned through Wolfgang, is actually amazingly a reference to the mystic north, or the cosmic north. And so people who are on a quest for the mystical Orient, it's not physically east, it's actually north. So there's been a number of inversions using other directions as coded ways of referencing the north. I'm also inclined to think that this idea of manifest destiny, going west, settling the west, is actually what they did was they borrowed northern symbolism for that campaign to go westward. So I've seen examples of the West being an encoded northern reference, the East for sure being an encoded northern reference, which is why in these Freemasonic tracing boards that I've been looking at lately and have been studying for years, actually, the pillar of transcendence, that middle pillar that goes to the underworld or to the heavens in the north, is indicated with an E, meaning east, meaning the cosmic north, not literal actual east. So you can see that why there's some confusion there. For a long time, that kind of eluded me. Why would this be pointed east? But thanks to Wolfgang, now I know it's actually pretty clear, that this is the case. So the South also being a symbolic reference to the North too. So when it comes to directional symbolism, I've seen instances where all of the directions in some traditions have been used as a veiled reference to the North, actually, as strange as that might sound.
Yeah, it's interesting. Have you noticed, this is kind of on topic still, I guess, but there's a lot of linkage between we're talking about the East. It just suddenly made this pop into my head. There's a linkage between Lovecraft and pre-Islamic folklore, as in like pre-Islamic myth in the Middle East. And I've noticed in recent years there's been a real boom in that information coming out. I don't know if there's a YouTube channel called Mysterious Middle East that covers a lot of this kind of folklore. I'm wondering have you looked into this, and do you think that there might be a kind of Lovecraft connection with that?
Interesting. No. I haven't
Oh,
noticed
okay.
anything.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah, okay. Don't worry about that, because I was wondering if you'd seen any of these, because what's really fascinating about them is you read through these myths, like these encounters with there's things like the Seven Towers of Satan, these kind of Nephilim type characters that keep appearing. You've got there's so many, and there's a fantastic there's a guy that's in what they call the MENA, which is Middle East, North Africa area. He keeps his identity secret, but he runs a YouTube channel called The Mysterious Middle East. And every time I watch that channel, I think, wow, this is Lovecraft. This is basically Lovecraft. And I wonder if there's like somehow Lovecraft was tapping into this kind of mythology, this ancient mythology, like you were talking about, and we're actually seeing some of it kind of coming to life, or the kind of the non-fiction version kind of coming, into our consciousness now. And I don't know, it's kind of a interesting thing to look at, maybe.
Yeah. The non-fiction, the factual version. I mean, I said talking to Maria the other day, we talked about Islam, and Islam is basically polar, and it's very interesting. There's one very interesting thing that needs to be stressed in this context, because Islam is mostly misunderstood, even by Muslims. I mean, they don't even understand the polar meaning of the Kaaba, for example, of Mecca. And as you might know, there are two words of creation. One is biblical and one is Quranic. And the biblical one is very famous in Kabbalah. It's called Bereshit, which means in the beginning. That's a literal translation of it. The rabbinical translation of these two words, Bereshit, is he created six. By six, usually they say the six directions of space. That means the word Bereshit, the word of creation, the beginning of the Bible, begins with the creation of the universe. Now, in the Quran, there is a different word of creation, which is part of the Islamic formula, Bismillah. It's called Bismillah. And both words, it is said in Islam, begin with a B, the letter B, the second letter, the letter B. Letter B in both Quranic symbolism and Kabbalistic symbolism means connection of two worlds. The second letter means connection of two worlds. It means the beginning of the Bible is the connection of two worlds. It begins with six directions. Now, what does the word Bismillah mean? It is different. It's a different word of creation. The reason is it is a different purpose. It's got a different purpose. The word Bismillah means in the name of Allah. And the word Allah is a mystery in itself. There are a lot of studies out on the word Allah, and even that concerning the word Allah, many Muslims don't know the way around. They just think it means God, simply God, like Yahweh or something, which is wrong. The Hebrew word, God word, Hashem, is a formula. It means name, the name. So what does Allah mean? It's a formula as well. And that's what I wrote about in my latest book, Necro Yoga. Allah is a negation of a letter. Because the word la, or lo in Hebrew, means no or not. It's a negation. So what does Allah mean? Allah means the negation of al, of one letter, the lamet, or the lam, the Arabic lam, which is the letter of connecting things, of energy transmission, and of knowledge. So there are two meanings. Bereshit, God, in a sense, created 6, and Bismillah, in the name of Allah. The Islamic formula of creation is a negation of creation. That means it is a call to reach back, to go back to the origins, as it is commonly understood in Islam, in Islamic mysticism. And that direction, and the direction referring to that, going back to that return to the origins, is the north. So it means we can say that Bismillah is the call to return to the north, the cosmic north. That means by negation of the L, the actual creation, the material creation, and the world structure as such, the matrix, in modern terms, call it matrix. So we have two different formula in two different religions. It's wrong to say, absolutely wrong to say, that both, as you often hear, that both religions share one origin. They do historically, Abrahamic religions. But that doesn't mean anything. They've got two diverging purposes. And this is put forward in the creation word of Bismillah, like in the creation word Bereshit in the Bible. So this is again polar. We have two sides, two poles, fighting for supremacy. In a sense, we can say.
It's interesting.
In the outward world,
Islam seems to be one of those religions that kind of it has. I'll be careful how I word this because I don't want to get in trouble. But there was a study an archaeologist recently looked at mosques. I need to say this in the right way. I kind of want to get in trouble. Right. So there was a dynastic shift. Yeah, there was a dynastic shift in Islam. But so basically what happened, I used to live in Saudi Arabia, so we used to learn a lot about the kind of Islamic history. And so there was basically what would happen a lot before Islam sort of stabilized was the different dynastic armies would take over rule in certain sort of key religious areas like Saudi Arabia, Mecca, this kind of thing. And there was a theory going around for a long time that the current location of Mecca was incorrect, that it'd been moved by one of these dynasties. And so an archaeologist, I can't remember his name for the life of me, but he's a really fascinating character. He basically identified all of the mosques in the world that were established pre this dynasty that he believed, or that a lot of people believe, had moved the position of Mecca. And the way he sort of tried to prove this theory was there's a wall in every mosque that's set up specifically to face Mecca, the location of the stone, essentially. So that his theory was, well, the way to test if it had been moved would be to basically draw a line from the walls of these mosques that were pre this dynasty and see where they point, because if they always point towards where the stone is, they should all point to the same direction. All of the mosques after this dynasty point to Mecca, what we consider Mecca to be now, but all the mosques prior to this dynasty point to Petra. And it's this fascinating thing of, like, when you look at Islam and key religions like Christianity, there's all this kind of manipulation going on all the time, and you really start to think, well, why are all these keystone things within these religions being manipulated all the time, and why are we being kind of led left and right, around certain things? And I wonder if one of that's just one example.
To manipulate our understanding of things. That's the only reason why.
Yeah,
and that means for certain brotherhoods, which I call the solar brotherhoods, the white brotherhood, to establish their power and remain in power. That's what they are and want to stay.
I know we had Alan Greenfield on recently. He's just written a book called The Black Lodge, looking at this idea of the Black Lodge, a real Black Lodge, rather than the kind of fictional Twin Peaks Black Lodge. And he says the same thing, that the kind of one of the goals of the Black Lodge is to kind of constantly manipulate perceptions of things, and kind of knock us off the course all the time. And it's an interesting, the more you look into that, the more real it seems to get each time, and it kind of, and you start to look at kind of more I guess, mainstream conspiracy theories, and they don't necessarily seem as wild as they would, as they do when you look at it through that lens. Especially, you think, oh, hang on, some of these do actually line up with what people like Greenfield are saying, more occult people are saying, and more, I guess, spiritual kind of conspiracies are saying. It's kind of, there's this interesting, it's kind of, it's an interest.
We're living in highly occult times. I mean, these days are really like fraught with occult, not necessarily symbolism, but occult actions. I mean, it's very occult. I mean, so we have, and in my view, it all started with, in recent history, it all started around 2016, 2017, when news came out that the Nephilim had returned to Antarctica, which in a sense is very strange because nobody said that, nobody said in the Bible that they disappeared. So how come that they return? Because they can return only if they weren't there. So I think they were always there. I would rather say it's an awakening. I would rather use the term awakening or reawakening of forces that, as Lovecraft wrote, are trying to rule the world again. And we have a ruling brotherhood, we have a ruling elite in every country, which is anonymous, more or less anonymous. I mean, don't think that the people we see in the media belong to the actual elite. The actual elite is anonymous, invisible, so we can't see them because they're socially invisible. They act through other people on the occult levels. So there are two brotherhoods at war at the moment. And they fight for supremacy. And it's a polar process that's going on because it started in Antarctica, it started in the south, and it's heading towards the north because the northern part is now in distress.
And what's interesting is one of a lot of the comments we got when we had Alan Greenfield on the show was that people were saying, "Oh, you're just talking, you just rebranded conspiracy theory. Essentially, you're talking about a Black Lodge instead of an Illuminati, or this sort of thing." It's possible, using that logic, then that this kind of the kind of goonification or whatever you want to call it of conspiracy theory. If you're a conspiracy theorist these days, we talk about this all the time on the show. It used to be a kind of subculture conspiracy theory back up until about around 9/11, and then it became this bigger thing that it is now. But it also got stigmatized at that point as well. And so now if you're a conspiracy theorist, you get tagged as right wing, you get tagged as, as the bad guy, essentially. Whereas but all this other research is coming in that seems to be validating a lot of it, or not necessarily validating a lot of it, but saying a very similar thing, that there's this hidden hand behind everything, that it could be, it could be human, it could be, a spiritual thing that's kind of controlling. But it is interesting, when we're talking about suppression, that's coming up as well recently.
Right. Regarding the switch of the Kaba cube, by the way, Petra, meaning stone, that to me makes a lot of sense. And kind of what you're referencing to, this shift or whatever, the cultural sacred center, spiritual core of a religion, to me, that's the shift we're talking about between polar to solar. That's the major shift. So right now, everyone's head is focused on the sun. And when you look at a lot of modern symbolism books, everything is solar based. And I've heard a lot of things from other people where they literally think everything in symbolism is just a reference to the sun. But what they don't realize is this is a newer god. We're talking about an older god when we're talking about northern polar symbolism. The same way, if you look into Set, as in the tunnels of Set, it's been said that Set hides behind Ursa Major, or Set is perhaps the 8th child of this 7-star system in the north. And so Set would be considered this older classification of deity associated with chaos, with this creatrix and everything else. And so when you were referring to Islamic or pre-Islamic mythology and everything else, we're talking about an older classification of deity. And so, yes, Lovecraft was tapping into the same idea, and he was associating it with the North, appropriately so. That's the symbolism, that the older tier of gods are more so related to this portion in the heavens.
What I'd like to add to what Mario said, that's right. It's absolutely right, because Seth or Zut or Satan. Actually, that's the word from Satan. Satan comes from the Egyptian, which means son of earth, the earthborn son, is polar, whereas Horus, his younger brother, is solar, and that's why Horus is. And here we have a link to Lovecraft's elder ones. The elder one is Horus. So Lovecraft explicitly wrote that the old ones are sometimes checked by the magic of the elder ones, and the elder ones are the Horian Brotherhood. That means the Horian Brotherhood is the solar, the White Brotherhood, has a certain power and certain influence on the magic of the old ones as well. So that's why the conflict is it could be. I mean, the outcome of the conflict is open, because who knows what magic, the old one's magic is supreme, sometimes the other one's magic is supreme. And that's exactly what Lovecraft wrote in many of his stories, because he wasn't so sure who's going to win. But at the moment, we've got that fight between Horus and Seth, between the polar and the solar brotherhoods. And that's what running the world, or the history, that's what making history at the moment. It's a history-making conflict ever since, in a sense.
Sure. And you'll notice too, on the Sun card in the Major Arcana, there's always a child there, which I think is very appropriate. And we refer to the Sun phonetically the same as a young boy, a son, S-O-N and S-U-N, because this is a younger god, in my opinion. That's kind of what's being said, versus the Star card, which is related to the stellar tradition, polar tradition. In fact, I think it's really interesting. Sort of my decode is that the Star card in the tarot, people question what star it is, but I'll tell you right now, it's actually the pole star, in my opinion. Some people have said it's Sirius, or it's, some of these other stars. I can see the case for that, but I really see it as the pole star relating to this earlier tradition. And you see a woman at night preparing a ritual bath. She's almost returning to the waters from which she came, from which she actually embodies. So here you have this deeply feminine sort of symbol with this figure at night, relating her to the darkness, to chaos, to this primordial sort of nature. And then you have the moon card. We know that that's our local moon. And then you have the sun card, with that child there. And so to me, very, very symbolic, these three cards. I think it's really referencing these three traditions. The star card, by the way, comes just after the tower card, which is a polar symbol, in and of itself. So I think there's kind of some overlapping themes going on there. And this card too, it's not uncommon for this card. What was that?
It's a phallic symbol. You meant the tower. It's a phallic symbol because the phallus is the symbol of the world axis. But as in the card, the tower got struck by lightning, and that's a mystery. That's the mystery behind it. What happened to the tower? What happened to the axis? What happened to the phallus, to the mystical phallus? So
there you go.
Something went wrong. Something went wrong. I mean, this is the underlying mystery in Lovecraft as well. If you read, for example, Mountains of Madness, you realize that the old ones fell off themselves. They declined. There was a decline among the old ones, as Lovecraft wrote it or described it in his words. So something happened, and there was an event in Earth history that changed the status quo, and brought the status quo which we have today, and the White Brotherhood being in charge of it. So there was a swap of things. By the way, the polar always includes the swapping of genders as well. I mean, male becoming female and female becoming male. That's what we have today, what we're witnessing today. We're witnessing this mix-up of genders, which on the unconscious level is a sign that polar activity is going on, that there's something changing in the polar structure, metaphysical structure of the human mind and the human energy field.
Yeah, interesting. So I think we'll call it there. Maybe we should do another one of these, actually, because this is actually really interesting. It's really good. But yeah, thanks to both of you for coming on. I've really enjoyed it. If people want to find you online, Mario, where's the best place?
Yeah, symbolicstudies.com.
And what do you have coming up, Mr. Muller? Do you have some new work you were saying about a sex magic book? Or no, the yoga book?
Well, I'm writing. I wanted to write a book on Draconian prophets on Lovecraft, Edgar Allan Poe, and Jules Verne, and bring the three together because they haven't been brought together yet in no book, nothing. I mean, it's just a blank, just a blank sheet, a blank paper. Yeah, I'm on it. But I might publish. I can say I might publish Polaria again as a PDF maybe in the future. Could be because I've heard there are many people longing to have it, so why not? I mean, I'm working on it.
Yeah, you should try and get a publisher to republish it, like a physical copy, because I mean, the secondhand market on that book is insane. It's like I found a copy the other day. I think it was £1,400. So £1,400. That's a yeah.
I know. So we might bring out a PDF from the original, the original scan actually as a PDF for download.